Great, thanks. And I just want to extend a thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real honour. I know it's been a long day for everyone, and hopefully we've had a lot of sort of discussion about all the concerns and problems with the international trading system. Hopefully this group is going to be on a bit more of a positive note about what the digital environment can do for international trade. So on that note, I'm going to talk about trends and issues in digital trade and new opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises. So I just want to start with a couple of sort of key digital trends which I identified, and a couple of them are obviously increasing internet access globally, so approximately 3.5 billion people are now online, and that's up from about 1.1, 1.2 billion people about 10 years ago, so 300% growth, and we've still got a lot of people that need to come online. And increasingly, this is on mobile phones. So we're talking about mobile internet access, which by 2020, approximately 50% of all people who are going to be accessing the internet are going to be doing it on mobile devices. The other dynamic here, and I'm going to emphasise this, I think, throughout the presentation, is that the entire economies are going digital. So, you know, the USITC did a great report, and they looked at digitally intensive industries, and even there you look at industries which are not IT, like manufacturing, wholesale, retail, services, but really it's the entire economy. There's no sector in an economy anymore that doesn't use email, that doesn't probably use Skype, that doesn't rely to some extent on internet access to run their business. So when we think about the opportunities here, we're talking today about digital trade, but really the difference between how economies use these technologies and the implications for the economy broadly and international trade is not a dividing line that's clear anymore. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. We're going to talk a little bit also about, obviously, the different ways this is going to affect the transformation in trade. And specifically, there's a bit about, I want to talk more about services. I want to talk more about platforms in this context. This graph picks up data flows globally. It's based on data flows along submarine cables. And I just put it up for a couple of reasons. I just want to show a sense of magnitude. It shows you that data flows on the transatlantic route between the US and the EU are about twice that of the other key routes between the United States and Latin America and the United States and Asia. But though most of the growth at the moment now in data flows is actually happening between across the Pacific, certainly between the US and Asia. There's a real challenge, though, between turning this understanding and sense of data flows into values of trade because the way data moves and the way the internet operates is there's a lot of transiting happening. So a lot of data is going through the US where it might originate in Latin America and end up in Europe. A lot of data from Africa might be transiting through Europe to get to the United States. And also the data doesn't correlate with value. You might have, very valuable design or information which is using very small packets of data and very large amounts of data for videos, for instance, which is actually of low economic value. But this at least gives a sense of trends in this direction. In terms of digital opportunities, this gets back to my original point that this is really about economic growth writ large, and it's very much about productivity gains and it's about jobs. And we've heard some great statistics that the USITC did on looking at the importance of digital trade for the US economy. McKinsey did a study earlier this year which concluded that, if you look at 2014, they suggested that 3.5% of global GDP growth was due to global data flows, which, if correct, means that it was larger than the contribution of global trading goods to GDP growth. We've heard about the importance of data flows for the US economy, but certainly it's about productivity gains. I mean, there's some work that's come out which shows that about 20% of labour productivity gains in the EU over the last 10 years were basically from internet use. So you see this happening at all different levels of the economy. Certainly there is new important opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses to participate in international trade. I'll elaborate on that as I go on. And there's this sort of broader servicification of trade, which I'll talk also a little bit about, which is essentially how the internet and data is enabling services to become a much more significant and important part of the way international trade works today. So let's just quickly think about what is digital trade. I've put out a fairly broad definition, and the point is that there's two drivers here. One is we're talking about the internet, and we're talking about also cross-border data flows. We're talking about the ability to search, purchase, sell and deliver goods and services online. So it may be simply that you're downloading music, downloading software, you may be purchasing online and having the good delivered to you. But there's also a really important part of this, which is what I think of as sort of digitally enabled trade, which is going to be in a whole range of areas where businesses in particular are going to be using digitally enabled services, often cross-border or provided from outside that country, to themselves become more productive and competitive in their own economies and also in overseas economies. So you've got to think about this, I think, quite broadly, and I think it's a way to approach this issue. I'm going to talk about four elements of digital trade and really how the internet and data are affecting economies more broadly. And we're going to look at platforms, services, value chains, and the opportunities for SMEs. If you think about platforms, what platforms essentially are is they're market makers. I mean, they're these, what economists would refer to as two-sided markets, where they essentially bring buyers and sellers together in ways that would not have been possible without that platform, because it was just too costly or too expensive to find the buyer, to find the seller. It was too costly or too expensive to verify whether you could trust that buyer or seller. So these platforms, in a sense, are overcoming a whole lot of barriers that the market had created to these transactions happening in the first place, and we're seeing them happen all over again. So if you take, for instance, Airbnb as one example, people have had rooms to rent out for a long time, but it was too difficult or costly to find people who might want that room at a particular time. It was probably too difficult for the renters to know whether the room they were getting was actually any good, or the people who were looking after that room were actually, trustworthy. And essentially, the Airbnb platform overcomes these challenges. This is true across a whole range of these new markets that we're seeing being created by the internet and data flows. So this is happening domestically, and it's also happening internationally, and that's where the international trade component comes into it. By one estimate, by 2017, approximately 45% of the world is going to be engaging in online commerce. So the opportunities here are certainly significant. And this is about overcoming domestic constraints, not just in the terms of transaction costs and the like, which I mentioned, but also, if you think about it, particularly from the digital sort of trade, the international component of this, things like, poor infrastructure, where you had trouble combining the purchase with access to the necessarily financial payment mechanisms, trust in the consumer that what you're actually purchasing online is actually verifiable and the like. A lot of these platforms solve these problems and actually allow the commerce to take place. In terms of SMEs, this is really the key part of it for them in one respect, because what we're certainly seeing, and Brian's going to talk about this in more detail, is that platforms like eBay, but Alibaba and Etsy are really new vehicles and opportunities for really small businesses to reach consumers globally, simply by having a presence on one of these platforms and to immediately become global players. So I'll give you the eBay data, at least for Korea, which is that if you are a small business on eBay, you are an exporter. 100% of them are exporters, and this compares to 20% of offline equivalents. And 98% of these small businesses that are on eBay are selling to over 10 countries. So it's just one example, and there's multitudes of how simply being on a platform makes you international in ways that was previously not possible. Digital services is a really big part of this. It's both about allowing digital services to be traded across borders, and it's also this secondary impact I was talking about, which is the access that businesses have to digital services, which makes them a lot more competitive and therefore better able to engage in both domestic and international commerce. So, we can think about the traditional professional services, financial, IT, law, education. A lot of this can be provided online. We don't have the data to actually determine how much of it is being provided online, but they're what are referred to as digitally enabled, in the sense that they are increasingly possibly being provided online. Another digital enabled service is big data, which is essentially the idea that a whole lot of data is being collected globally now as a result of people being online, and it's being analysed, aggregated, and analyse to provide a whole lot of new opportunities and insights, which is a key new tool for businesses. It requires cross-border data flows because it's often aggregating data sets that are being collected globally, and it is having an impact on a whole range of business cycles. So, for example, a PricewaterhouseCoopers estimate is that it's going to increase business revenues by around 3% over the next year as businesses use big data more effectively. BMW, I'll give you one example, open innovation platforms, where it's allowing collaboration between designers from outside companies. So BMW has this thing called an idea management system where they basically get people to suggest ideas for new designs for their cars, and they're actually finding that using this open innovation platform, collecting that information, analysing it, means that they're incorporating new ideas into their cars faster and at a more rapid pace than they had in the past. There's a UK, you hear a lot on the retail side, Ocado, which is a UK retailer, collects about 100 terabytes of data, which drives its decisions about knowing more what their consumers want, and they use this data to better manage and have more efficient delivery routes. Cloud computing is a really key and digitally deliverable or digitally enabled service as well. There's a whole taxonomy of it, which I'm not going to go into at this stage, but I simply want to make the point that with internet access and the ability to move data across borders, cloud computing now makes IT a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot more accessible. So this means that you don't have to have a standalone, expensive sort of IT sector. You can basically be a small business. You can access a type of computing power you need in the cloud. You can scale it when your business demands need it. You can pay for it as you go. And you don't have to have the upfront investment, which is a particular capital cost for small businesses. It means that small businesses now have access essentially to the type of computing power that has previously really only been available for large companies, and often the computing power that they're accessing is much more secure because it's being provided by professional cloud computing service providers like Amazon and Microsoft, rather than sort of managing their own small IT department. Again, a key driver of productivity. It requires cross-border data flows, and it will allow small businesses to be a lot more competitive domestically and also internationally. The Internet of Things, another data-intensive, digitally enabled service. So this is all about putting sensors on things, which is going to also generate a whole lot of data. So this is going to be another large driver of big data. It's going to require, again, cross-border data flows, because a lot of these data sets are going to be produced between countries, and they're going to be aggregated and analysed and used. Businesses are already using data. They're putting them into their factories to improve their production schedules. If you look at Vestas, which is a Danish wind turbine company you've probably heard of, they have sensors in all their turbines located globally. They analyse this data from a single centre in Denmark. They can predict from these sensors when parts need to be replaced before they break down. They can then communicate with factories located around the world and get the parts delivered to the turbine before the part breaks down. This is all being enabled by global data flows. It also underlines the point that a lot of goods that are being traded are increasingly valuable because of the services that are being provided on top of these goods. So if you take Caterpillar, which is a very large sort of machinery mining company of transportation equipment in the United States, they sell, large earth movers, mining equipment. A lot of the value of that equipment now is the sensors on the equipment, which is like looking at grade levels, it's looking at how they're driving it, it's analysing when parts need to be replaced, and it's providing all these value-added over-the-top services, which is relying on, again, sensors and the ability to move data globally and analyse it and add that value. Global value chains essentially are enabled by global data flows. Obviously important for Korea, a big participant in global value chains. The OECD estimates that about 40% of Korea's exports actually incorporate foreign import. And you think about email, you think about production schedules, you think about designs, you think about HR data, you think about trying to respond to consumer demands quickly. It's all about collecting data and moving data globally. Again, it's another important opportunity for SMEs to plug into these global value chains in discrete ways. They can provide so-called tasks to actually become part of the global economy and part of global value chains in ways that was previously not possible. So I've talked about some of the SME opportunities as I've been gone through it, and I just sort of underline the point that what we're really talking about here is the platform component and also the access to these digital services, which are making them both more competitive and also providing opportunities to reach consumers globally. So I want to talk a little bit now about some of the challenges. We've heard a little bit about that today, and I want to underline a couple of things. One is that, back to my original point, there's no clear distinction between how these technologies are used from a domestic sort of broad economic perspective and what it means for digital trade. Really, this is about creating sort of enabling environments throughout an economy, which is going to improve productivity, and it's also then going to have a flow-on effect on international trade. So you've got to do things like get down the cost of internet access and the cost of internet devices. You've got to look at things like the regulatory environment, which gets at issues around privacy, intellectual property, consumer protection, even education, making sure that there's a skills base to actually take advantage of these opportunities to produce the content that can then go online as well. It's also about addressing issues like data localization requirements, which are being driven by a whole range of different sort of demands, whether it's law enforcement or security or protectionism and the like. So this is, in order to grow digital trade and really make economies of digital, there's two agendas here. One is essentially a regulatory agenda. So what we're seeing, and you take privacy as a good example, is that as data can move seamlessly across borders in increasingly enormous quantities, regulators in different areas are finding that achieving their regulatory goal is increasingly difficult in the presence of the ability to move data globally. So if you look at the EU, for instance, the EU essentially says you cannot take personal data outside of the EU to another jurisdiction that doesn't have equivalent privacy protections, right? So it's essentially a barrier on cross-border data flows, which they naturally feel they have to implement if they want to preserve their view of what type of privacy EU citizens are entitled to. So you're going to see this across regulations, whether it's health or education or in the consumer protection area, that unless there is better regulatory cooperation to understand common goals and how to achieve them and whether there is equivalency, you're going to increasingly see that regulators are going to have incentives to put up barriers to cross-border data flows. The other part of it is creating a trade policy, and that it also enables this to happen. And in one sense, you probably need to get the regulatory agenda right first before you have more success here. Because until you've got trust amongst regulators that they can achieve their domestic goals, they're going to resist further liberalisation at the trade policy level. But the trade policy level is a combination of the following. One is to recognise that in the WTO, there's actually a lot there that actually supports and enables digital trade through particularly some very good appellate body decisions such as US gambling and China audiovisual. We now know that if you've made a commitment in services, then that's a commitment also in services that are delivered online. And essentially what it really means is that there's arguably a commitment already to allow data to flow freely to enable the delivery of any type of service commitment that's already been made under the GATS. We've got the International Technology Agreement, which has been updated, which reduces barriers on the types of equipment and other goods which are needed to enable digital economies to grow. There's a telecommunications annex, which looks at access to public telecommunications networks, and a telecoms reference paper, which also has regulatory principles to encourage competition in the telecoms market, which is obviously key to reducing the cost of internet access. Free trade agreements is obviously a route where countries have looked to make progress here. In fact, the United States-Korea FTA was really the first FTA to have language on cross-border data flows. It was limited. It referred to an endeavour to refrain from imposing unnecessary barriers, so really just sort of a best efforts attempt. The TPP certainly went a lot further in the sense that it required cross-border data flows subject to an exceptions provision. And in that sense, the TPP, dead or alive, dead by the looks of it, certainly was the cutting edge in terms of the types of rules that the trading system needs. So we had commitments not to require, data localization, data flows, source code, balanced intellectual property rules, which was both about having in place intermediary liability protection as well as how copyright is now being framed. But we've also got other negotiations going on which could potentially be important if they are successful. We've got the trade and services agreement negotiation, where certainly the issue of rules on digital trade are being discussed intensely. We've got the transatlantic negotiations, where this isn't a live issue. So these are going to remain, I think, key vehicles for trying to make progress here, because these are cutting edge, and countries are not, you know, it's for multilaterally, we're not going to get to that standard necessarily. The WTO is looking at what it can do on digital trade issues. So, in a sense, you know, multilateralism is always an ultimate goal here. But if you look at sort of the policy proposals out there, they're to be encouraged, but they're fairly, you know, I wouldn't say low standard, but they're really focused on this issue of, you know, de minimis duties and improving customs facilitation, which are all important, certainly for SMEs on platforms that are selling small value goods. And so you want to reduce those barriers. And so there's some progress which could also be made there. On the regulatory agenda, APEC and the OECD, particularly around privacy issues, are making some good progress. So again, you know, the regulatory agenda is going to be absolutely key here, and getting at it through regional and multilateral forum is going to be necessary, because we're going to have to do this ultimately multilaterally, because the internet is global, data flows globally, and so doing this bilaterally or, you know, trilaterally and the rest of it is only going to be moving the ball so far. And you see the countries bilaterally are making statements about the importance of internet access and openness, and really just trying to set some norms and some standards there in terms of what should be achieved there. So these, you know, there's a comprehensive, I think, list of what needs to be done, but we need to get the regulatory piece right and then get into the trade policy piece. Thanks.